Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Thanks also to those of you out there in Radio Land. I'm very glad that you could all join us today. This is Bruegel, the economics think tank in Brussels, and what we're going to be talking about today is coherent and consistent implementation of EU digital policies. Now, what inspires the session today? Well, a concern that I and many policy experts have had for some time is that there's a huge barrage of new digital policies coming down the pike, plus a large number that were enacted not so long ago during the last legislative term. So we're looking at the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, DGA, the European Health Data Space Regulation, and also strategic instruments like the RRF, the Digital Compass, added to existing legislation like the European Electronics Communication Code and the GDPR. So it's a lot. It's really a lot. Many different thematic areas covered by these: privacy, cybersecurity, competition, innovation, industrial policy, you name it. The concern that I've been worried about for some time has been, how do we actually get joined up policy across so many different areas at the same time? The EU is a regulatory powerhouse. We have the Brussels effect, where we pull in other countries into things that we do, but have we bitten off more than we can chew here? How do we actually manage this huge volume of complexity? And the complexity is at many levels. On the one hand, it has to do with consistency among the legal instruments themselves. On another, it has to do with complexity across the different thematic areas, like security, privacy, competition, innovation, and so on, each of which typically has its own instruments, its own tools, and its own agencies, both at European and member state level in many cases. So really, how do we get consistency there? How do we get consistent implementation between the member states and the EU, where, once again, each of the legal instruments, in general for legitimate reasons, has a different approach to achieving that kind of coordination? How do we get coordination across the member states and between them? How do we make all of this stuff work? And so that's actually what had inspired the discussion for today. I'm absolutely delighted that we have some very fine speakers to cover these issues today. Unfortunately, the empty chair, I presume that our first speaker is delayed, but we'll work with it. I'm expecting a member of the European Parliament, Axel Voss, to show up momentarily. He's been very active in a lot of these themes. He and his staff have been talking about them for some time. He was very much a central figure in GDPR, in the AIDA report on artificial intelligence for the Parliament. So again, he's been heavily involved in precisely the digital themes that we're looking at today. Our second speaker, who may end up being our first speaker, depending on when Mr. Voss shows up, is Cornelia Kutterer, who's let me get the title right, Senior Director for European Government Affairs at Microsoft. And we'll also be hearing from Anne-Marie Sipkes, who is a director of the Authority for Consumers and Markets, the ACM in the Netherlands. I was especially interested in having a speaker from the Netherlands because they have a very interesting model for achieving joined-up policy between different thematic areas, between different agencies within the Netherlands. It seems to me that there are things that Europe might profitably learn from this example, also from a somewhat similar entity in the United Kingdom, the DRCF. So again, it seemed to be an interesting thought model. So that's what actually inspires the session today. And Mr. Voss is here. Brilliant. So we will be able to follow the hoped-for sequence. Mr. Voss, I hope you'll be able to speak first with introductory comments for about 10 minutes. Good. Okay, they're miking him up now. So let me talk a little bit about housekeeping for the session while he gets set up. So again, my thought was that the sequence would be Mr. Voss, then Ms. Kutterer, then Ms. Sipkes, and that in total, the initial interventions are likely to run for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll open up for question and answer. I may toss out a question or two myself, but actually my preference would be that we take as many questions as possible from the audience. And for that, I'll be asking questions or inviting questions from those of you in the room, but I'll also be able, thank you very much, I'll also be able to take questions from those of you out in Radio Land. So there's a platform that we use, Slido. If you just enter sli.do into your browser, Slido will come up, and you'll need a hashtag. If you enter hash digital with a capital D, you'll be able to answer questions. And the way the thing works is you can actually vote for questions that other people have answered. The more frequently asked or voted for questions bubble to the top. I'll try to pick some of the questions out. You folks don't have to worry about that because I'll be reading the questions off as they come in, or the ones that seem most interesting to me. And so with that, I'd actually like to open the session up to our wonderful speakers and to first invite Mr. Voss to talk about this very hard question of how we get joined up policy within the EU, between the EU and the member states, across the member states, on all these very different thematic areas. I know that you've been active on this topic within the EPP, and that it also meshes well with your interests in updating the GDPR. Mr. Voss is, among other things, he and his staff are authors of GDPR 2.0. So with that, over to you, Mr. Voss.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me and having the kind of a first session in the year, in the new year, and all the best for everyone. So I think the situation is already very, let me put it this way, kind of a survival training. I see the European Union in not a good shape regarding digital issues. And that's why I think we need to do more than just putting on the table one legal instrument after the other. So this is, from my point of view, not a kind of a strategy. That's why we need to come forward. It was correct in saying we need to protect personal data as a kind of a key instrument, but then when we have done this, we should also think how we can balance this better. And so far, if you're looking to some figures regarding market capitalization, then you will find a huge dot for the US, also huge dot for Asia, and then a little small dot for Europe, and followed by Africa already. And it's very close. And here, from my point of view, you can immediately see as a politician, we need to do something. And this is what I'm missing, especially a kind of a strategy. So from my point of view, it's not enough in saying, oh, here's a problem, we have to do here something, there's a problem, we have to do something. And even not having in mind with the situation how we can support and enable and unleash the potential of European creative digital industry and supporting these. Therefore, I would say if we are just sticking also in all these instruments, we are all these legal reports and tools, what we have on the table, in saying, but don't touch the GDPR, this is, from my point of view, not a kind of a future-orientated wording and so on. We haven't discussed in the GDPR negotiations AI. We haven't discussed blockchain. We haven't discussed platforms and so on, and especially not metaverse, if this is coming to reality one day. And therefore, from my point of view as a legislator and as my understanding as a politician, I would say, oh, we have a problem, we should solve it. Now with our structure and the way how we are dealing with this takes too much time. And again, we do not have political will, it seems so, or the political courage to solve these problems, especially also if you are coming surgically towards the GDPR and saying, oh, there's a problem, we should solve it, just a small point of view. But with the GDPR, I see on 5 levels more than less a kind of a problem. At first, we do not have a kind of a unified application throughout the EU. And even if there is already, or there's a will of doing so, it takes too much time. Secondly, the guidelines created by EDPB might be wonderful, creative, but it's totally not practical, it's too complicated, and so on. Then we might find some problems where I would say we need to change the legal text. It doesn't mean we should open up everything and so on. We can, of course, but it's not necessary. On the 4th level, we have to adapt new technologies in the GDPR, but we are creating now a kind of a system where you have a lot of different tools in place. And of course, and at the 5th level, you might come, or you have to think about, are the principles still the right ones? So deleting data, only processing them for one purpose. And so data minimization. If we're coming to the AI situation, you will need a lot of personal data to create a result out of algorithm and training and testing and so on with personal data. And if we are not providing these, then we are not coming forward with AI. And everything what will be developed in the future is built upon AI. And if we are not taking part in these developments, then we are out. And this is what I'm fearing, and this is why I'm complaining all the time in saying we need to be more future orientated. And yeah, of course, then if we are seeing if metaverse is really something what might be a kind of a tool in the future, and this will be extremely disruptive, I can't even see how we might protect personal data, how we might will come forward if we are not providing data, if we are not providing AI systems. Do we still have a kind of a will of survive in Europe, also in a digital age? We try to line or give a kind of an idea in the AIDA report in coming forward, but this is like how it always is. You're creating these, everyone is saying, oh, fantastic, wonderful, but nobody is taking care of these. And here I'm expecting more in this surviving question, that we are not thinking about problems and how to solve this legally, that we are also putting a lot of money into it, and that we have skills around, and then we can also think about all these legal questions for all of these. And this is how I'm seeing the developments, and I would say we probably in Europe have only 2 years, 3 years. This might be very optimistic already. If we are not having a kind of a serious plan in supporting European industry in AI. Some companies are already saying regarding AI and training the algorithms, oh, I'm leaving and I'm going to Africa, because it's not that complicated, it's probably not that expensive, and then they are returning. But this shouldn't be our intention as a legislator. But in the parliament, you're not finding someone except me probably in saying, oh yes, we have to correct the GDPR, because I have the feeling nobody is really knowing what is in the GDPR. The GDPR is better created than we are behaving. And this is why I'm frustrated sometimes if we are coming to these new tools. Everyone is saying, oh, don't touch the GDPR. No, we have to think about to better balance not infringing the privacy and individual rights and data, their personal data, but also developing. It's more work, it's more creativity, but I think we have to go this way. Sorry for this long explanation. Yeah.
On one related topic that I know you've also written on for EPP, and that is how to try to get more synergy, more communication across all of these different legal instruments, across all of these different bodies like BEREC and EDPB and the ECN, the Competition Network, and all of the others. This is something that you have written about.
Yeah, so what we are seeing this term in the parliament and on the European level is, yes, we have a lot of problems. Now we are coming, it might be a little bit odd in telling this in such a way, but I think, yes, now we have understood that data sharing might be a kind of an added value. And now we have to find a way around the GDPR, how we can share more data and how we can come forward with it. And so a lot of legal tools are provided, but I think it's the same in the Commission like in the Parliament. It's done by different generals, directors, silos, and also in the committees. And because it's in parallel, nobody is really paying attention to the outcome of the other silo. And this is creating a lot of legal uncertainty, and it's creating a mess in a way, even if we're coming to definitions. And here we should be more careful that what we are creating should be a kind of legal certain, also towards the other tools. And this is my impression. This is not happening any longer. Because of time pressure, political pressure probably, and we have to, and so on. But it's not helpful if the industry then at the end is totally confused. And if we are looking to the Market Act, Digital Market Act, yeah, there's also said, oh, not touching the GDPR, but the consent is somehow in a way also a kind of competitiveness understanding. And all of a sudden, as a company, you have the data protection authorities, the competitive authorities, and this is not helpful. And there we should have one body and thinking and structured and coming everything together. But if this is not done by the commissioners and in a way and everyone is doing its own, then we are out of the global competition.
Those are worrisome thoughts. But with that, I'd actually like to hand off to our second speaker. I think we just heard concerns that industry might be confused. I'd like to know if industry is confused. And also, we talk about Brussels effect. I know Microsoft, I think on occasion, has argued that it would be better for something like GDPR to be widely adopted than to have 200 different models in 200 different countries. Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing, I know you've worked a lot with these issues, Cornelia, so I'd really welcome your thoughts on this.
Yes, first of all, thanks for inviting me. I hope this is working. I put this a little bit aside. Thanks, Axel, for this introduction, which I think is great to dive into the conversation. First of all, on regulation per se, I think we have embraced regulation. We are a technology provider. We understand the technology is pervasive. Society will have to adapt and regulation is necessary, but regulation needs to be implementable, it needs to be outcome oriented, and it needs to be targeted to the specific problems. And I think there's a lot of discussion room with some of the regulation that we have been seeing. Challenges have, of course, occurred also because the technology is converging. So you have no longer very sector-specific technology. Think about productivity suites or productivity tools that have been merging with communication tools, so that you have now features in other tools, or in the gaming sector, features that are communication services that fall into the telecommunication remit. So I'll come back to that in a second. That creates, of course, conflicting obligations, and it also occurs that the public policy objectives that these different rules are trying to achieve in itself might in conflict, and so there needs to be a little bit more of a balance within those different public policy objectives. And they used not to be so. Are you helping me out? Thank you. Here. Thanks a lot. Just going back very quickly on the more macroeconomic issues that Axel was mentioning, and I want to make that very clear. At least we believe that AI, and we totally agree with Axel on this, who is not uptaking AI now will have a huge competitive disadvantage going forward. And I think that's a general risk that Europe is confronting. This is combined with two areas. The first is these AI tools, in particular the foundational models that we're talking so much about currently. They are really disinflationary tools, so they will help companies to create efficiency that they will need to survive, in particular in economic crisis. But more importantly, there is, if you look at statistics, in Europe you have a workforce decline over the next 20, 30 years, and Europe will only be able to counterbalance this if they have this uptake. So there's many, many reasons for Europe really to be concerned about the uptake of AI. Going back to the topic, I wanted to quickly give two examples or more on the conflicting obligations, and then looking at the implementation and a little bit on the compliance, which then hopefully will be a good transition. So we have, just to give you a couple of examples, the Electronic Communication Code. There has been enormous discussions to integrate the OTTs, the over-the-top providers, and there were lots of discussions around making them interoperable with each other. So you have a provision in the Electronic Communication Code that regulates that regulators might be able to impose interoperability. There is, of course, always competition questions, whether this is actually desirable or not, but leaving that aside, we have re-regulated this in the DMA. So there's just an additional regulation, takes it from a different approach. So this is not necessarily conflicting, but duplication to a certain extent. Then we have conflicts in the context of the public policy objectives. So we've seen the integration of the Electronic Communication Code, the OTTs. It's a market regulatory tool, but in the annex, the e-privacy directive was listed, which created another problem in the context of safety. So, and there was no discussion on what this means. So December 2020, we had to make a decision whether we stop scanning for child sexual abuse material on our services, merely because of this directive. And then the Commission needed to course correct, and this is what you're saying, they needed to course correct and came up with the interim regulation, but it left the companies with these binary choices between either privacy or safety, and that shouldn't necessarily happen. So now we are working on the CSAM regulation as the sustainable tool to find a sustainable solution going forward. And then we have, of course, and this goes back to Axel, we have numerous other areas. I think in the GDPR itself, anonymization was seen as sort of the solution to everything, but now, of course, we know that anonymization is no longer the technology for everything, but it doesn't recognize other privacy-enhancing technologies like privacy-preserving machine learning, rightly so, because it was not considered AI at the time. So a little bit more openness here would probably be useful in order to keep up with the technology that provides solutions to the public policy objective that the GDPR was trying to achieve. And then in the AI Act, just to give one last example, we are not catering necessarily for data protection, we're catering for other fundamental rights, and one of which is discrimination, which is one of the core concerns in the context of AI. But the ability to have high data quality sets that, for example, ensures that the same quality of service is delivered to different demographic groups might be difficult to achieve if the sensitive data cannot be processed. And so there is now the question, and this goes to Axel's point, will this requirement be without prejudice to GDPR, or will we find a solution that ensures that this data can be processed for this specific tool? So these are a couple of the conflicts that we are grappling with. Then going very quickly to the now compliance, the point that you made about we in the compliance have, of course, an interest for global harmonization. And so GDPR, data subject rights, we have globally adopted. And so we work on international standards that helps us to sort of find ways to align the different requirements in different regional data protection tools. And this becomes, by the way, more difficult now, and it's probably a geographic issue, where more social questions are addressed, such in the Digital Services Act, where when you look at Australia, for example, they take very different approaches, and there's more global conflict potential, or if you look at the USA versus Europe in these spaces. Currently, as probably many follow, the compliance work has started. We have many services that fall under the DSAs, so all these services are currently busy with understanding and interpreting. There's a lot of interpretation that needs to be done on a service level once you are at this stage. And just to give you example, it's like precisely the features. Is this a separate service? When it is a separate service, which parts of the service fall into which classification? So this will. I think it's normal that we have to deal with this. I don't think that the law can be as specific, but it will require a lot of cooperation in this context. And then of course in the DMA it's very similar. You mentioned the data access, so the privacy issues. So as we look at these things in the context of compliance, I think we will need a lot of guidance from the Commission going forward in helping the companies to crystallize which requirements have to be fulfilled and how. And those conversations are starting. So it's still, I think, what we're going to see over time is eventually similar to the e-commerce directive, because the e-commerce directive, in a way, was the jurisprudence over the time that clarified a lot of the issues, and I would foresee something similar happening with the DSA as well. And then lastly, on the enforcement, again, it's interesting, GDPR, I think 2022 was the GDPR year. There was a lot of enforcement going on and sort of crystallizing a little bit what that means. And there has also been, I think, a crystallization of some of the shortcomings of the GDPR. So addressing these at one stage, I think, will be necessary. E-commerce directive took 20 years, so maybe we should think about like reviewing these things a little bit quicker. The interesting part is, of course, DSA has a different enforcement model from GDPR. What we see, the digital service coordinators, they're in many countries, it's not clear yet. We're trying to follow as closely as possible. We will have services that will be regulated by the Commission. We will have many services that will be regulated by the Irish Digital Service Coordinator. But of course, all the others will be important too because of the dispute settlement possibilities that exist. And that coordination will have to be done, and the complaints that can be provided to them. What I think is interesting is that the choices that the member states take in who is actually the authority, and what we're seeing, there's divergence, and that might actually have an impact on how they are deciding these issues. So if you have, my understanding, I'm not entirely sure, so forgive me if this is wrong, but there is conversations, I keep it very high level, conversations in Germany, for example, that the digital service coordinator will be the Bundesnetzagentur, which is a telecom regulator, versus in Ireland where it is a media regulator. They have very different cultures in approaches and backgrounds. So this is going to be interesting to see. And it's going to be even more interesting when you look at the AI Act, where a lot of the enforcement is going to be done on a national level. So GDPR has one way of trying to harmonize and have this one-stop shop. And in the AI Act, we have a very different approach, depending on the outcome of the legislative discussions, of course, as well. So there will be a lot of challenges going forward, but we hope that the coordination will help through this.
Thank you, Cornelia. Just for the benefit of the audience, I should probably clarify one point that Cornelia was talking to. The way GDPR is structured is a so-called one-stop shop, where essentially the European home of a corporation is where the responsible supervisory authority is for essentially anything in Europe. But what this means, in effect, is that two small European member states, Ireland and Luxembourg, get almost all of the serious cases, which is a bit bizarre. Now, with that, however, one of the things you touched on is who within the member state actually implements all of these measures. And I know that this is an issue that very much is on your mind, Director Sipkes. And so with that, I'd like to hand over to you. Is what the Netherlands doing an interesting thought model for other member states or perhaps for the EU as a whole?
Thank you. And also, on my part, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss at the start of this year on how to implement this immense digital agenda from Europe. Last year I was chair of BEREC, the European body for electronic communication regulators. This year I'm only outgoing chair, so I will not be talking about BEREC too much, but I've been following closely the immense agenda and the enormous speed. But actually, of course, now we are in the second phase, which is on implementation, which is just as much work. And I think we've already touched upon the enormous amount of dilemmas and trade-offs that we see within the different interests. Digital is not one sector, there's not one dimension, there's all these different interests that have to be taken into account. So how do you get your head around that? And I'll be talking mainly on the Dutch experience. One of the things that I've learned, and the ACM is an integrated authority, we're one of the very few in Europe that have within its walls the competition authority, the consumer authority, and we're also the regulator for telecoms, postal transport, that's my directorate, as well as open internet, and we're also the energy regulator. And we do all that by actually just kind of a limited amount of people. We only have 600 people or so. We were integrated 10 years ago. And that was actually quite on time because you have to get to know each other. And 5 years ago, we started out from my directorate. And we got a bit worried about app stores. We looked at the internet and we said, we're the regulator for open internet and net neutrality. And what's going on here? What if app stores is part of internet and part of infrastructure? And is it open enough? And then our competition colleague said, nah, that's just, Google is an amazing company and Apple is an amazing company and just got good business models. And of course, they're growing and they're making a profit because they should. And our consumer authority said, consumer colleagues said, we get some complaints. And we made one team. And we said, well, just go out there, do a market study, and see what's out there. And we did two really weird things. First, we get this interdisciplinary team. And second, we got an internal scientific advisory board. And we just went out there and gathered knowledge, which I think is the first thing. You have to get a deep understanding of what is going on a technical level, economic level, business models. And that resulted in a market study. And we started out from concerns from open internet, and we ended up with a classic 102 case against Apple, forcing Apple for different payment methods, which is completely not where because what we did was first get an understanding for market dynamics, get an understanding for business models, get an understanding for risks, get that out there. So that actually benefited also learning from colleagues within Europe, but as far as Capitol Hill and Australia. And then we said, but we see one thing here that's not only potentially a risk for the working of the Dutch economy, but it's also maybe something against competition law. So let's start a formal investigation. And that ended up into the 102 case that we just finalized. So you start out with you get a risk-based approach. You have expertise from different legal perspectives. You start with knowledge and experience with network of shareholders. You make new friends. We started talking to people in gaming industry that don't know about competition law. They don't know there's a competition regulator. They don't know that they can complain. That is in the Netherlands, let alone they will never come to Brussels. They just, that's too far out. But they do have a problem with Apple and Google. And they thought they had a problem, and it was up to us to say, is this something that we have to address as a regulator? Or is it just, life is difficult and running a business is complicated? So this is one example where, as an integrated authority, you get a deep sense of where the market's at, you have a problem, and only then you start thinking about what would be the best way to address this problem. And there are these trade-offs. Second example, as a consumer authority, we're kind of getting the same unease for some years on dark patterns, on the way that choice architecture is designed. And here you see trade-offs that are partially within consumer protection on sequencing or choice decision boxes or all these things that you have in choice architecture. On the one hand, is it honest vis-a-vis consumers? Is it good for competition? But also, if you get a personalized offering, how many data can a company collect to make sure that you get a personalized offer? And when is it starting to get a bit awkward from a privacy perspective? So there are all these trade-offs, which are part of the deal. And we know from privacy, so we are aware ourselves that this is important, but we're not the experts. So we have to get them on board to make sure that we think, okay, so what worries us, what is potentially harmful, and also what instruments are there. And there are trade-offs. And there's only one way, in our perspective, to get your heads around that, and that is actually get down, do the work, do the investigation, do the research. So implementing is just not just about, it's about first getting this understanding, giving guidance. I really understand my third really favor on cooperation. I'm sorry. Again, you have to get a deep understanding. There's these trade-offs because there's all these different dimensions, different market players, and you have to get the real experts to the table. So you have to cooperate. We had to cooperate within the ACM, but we know we have to cooperate with the other relevant authorities as well. And we started 1.5 years ago at our executive level to have a discussion with the 4 independent regulators saying we have this whole body of legislation from Europe coming towards us that we want to take serious and we want to implement. But how are we going to do this together from our expertise? So that's us, that's the Privacy Authority, it's the Financial Behavior Authority, and it's the Media Authority. So we're the 4 real independent regulators. We thought, who would we think is best placed to be the coordinator, to make sure that from the outset we guide our own institutional setup and we try to stay out of the turf wars as much as possible. So that was a success, so that's good. And we now have done something which is very important, very effective, and not very sexy. That is procedural arrangements. So if you are a digital service coordinator, and we are the one that are proposed to Parliament to be appointed as digital service coordinator, we will be the one-stop shop. But if it's not within our remit, privacy, for example, or media authority, we, of course, will relay it to our colleagues. But then you have to make arrangements. How much time will I take to look at this issue and send it on to the next party? How much time will the other party get, what deadline, to make sure that it doesn't matter. You mean, front office is something different from back office, and you can count on us to have a timely but an expert answer. So it's in things like that you make sure that you have all the expertise, but you have one front office, and that should also be the part where you give your guidance on how do I see these open norms. And open norms is the only thing that will work in this digital world, of course, because the technology is changing too much, and otherwise you get a GDPR, but you think, is this still relevant given the technological progress? But it means also you have to give guidance. So in implementing and regulating also means giving guidance. And cooperation actually, it is something that these 4 organizations are starting this work. We use at an executive level to make sure that we have these procedural arrangements, we know one another, and now what we are starting to do is actually to start doing work together in the sense that we are now in next month we will publish common principles on effective transparency. Because we all know that the kind of transparency that says if you want to proceed, you have to read the next 600 pages and tick a box and say, I agree. That is the kind of transparency in consumer issues that's not very effective. And we all 4 have different experiences and different norms. And what we have done is compared them and make sure that we have common principles. So you know in the Netherlands, these 4 authorities, these are our common principles. We will do the same in talking about marketing, in transparency and marketing activities by influencers and especially financial influencers. How transparent are these on who pays them? And we'll do something extra on marketing, especially targeted to children, which as a consumer authority, as a vulnerable group, is very important to us, but also to the media authority. So here we try to combine and find common ground to make sure that where we can have one consistent, we have consistency. And there will always be trade-offs and dilemmas and case-by-case approaches. But by making these common principles known, we work together to formulate our common principles, and that also makes a basis for if on a case-by-case basis we have to think of something different, or there's an example, or we have to get our head around these examples. The same thing happens internationally, and it happens bottom-up. It's already happening without anybody forcing us to do. Platform to Business. The Platform to Business Act has no specifications on enforcement. It's a very important and often overlooked piece of legislation on transparency. There are a lot of small business users that say, somebody kicked me off the platform. I don't know why. Is there something I did do or did not do? What did I violate? Can somebody please tell me? Because I don't agree. And is there any way I can get back on this platform? Because it's important. This is what the Platform to Business says. You have to be transparent. And if you have a complaint, but there's no enforcement. Every member state was free to choose. One consequence, it's very little known because there's no national communication. But slowly now, NRAs, especially in telecoms world, are now being assigned to be a public regulator. Italians were first, the Irish are now, and again, we are in a proposed law in Parliament, the Platform to Business regulator. And we're kind of proactive. So we have no powers yet, but we already formulated proposed draft guidelines, saying, these norms are very open, they're not very known, but should, in case we are regulator, and there's a real chance that we will be, but the moment we are, this is how we think you should implement this norm. This is where we think our standards, and we are opening this up for consultation. That already has an impact on the market. No enforcement, but real implementation, because we also know that a lot of platforms want to be compliant. So they say, this is our level. If you want more, tell me. Well, there you are, our draft guidelines. I will tell you. But then the Italians started to call us saying, you're doing something on platform to business. What are you doing? Because we've been doing this. And the Irish are calling. And now all of us are saying, are you relevant? Or do you get any powers? And what are you encountering? How are you approaching it? Because we have learned that you can be more efficient and effective if you learn from colleagues. And we all know that we need consistent implementation. Because it's a European market. We have national specific circumstances. So you cannot do anything. You cannot do everything from Brussels. You have national circumstances, but you want to be consistent as much as possible because it is a European market. And by exchanging these experiences, nobody forces us, but there's a lot of networks being networking going around and practices being exchanged, which may not be too visible to the outside world, but I do think they are going to be very effective in creating this European digital market.
Thank you very much for very, very thoughtful comments. Well, I'm happy to say the published schedule called for us to be switching to question and answer at 1:45, so we're just about there. Our normal practice is to take perhaps 3 questions and then give the speakers the opportunity to comment on whichever one of them, the questions, or more than one, that inspire them. I also have some from the remote audience by way of the Slido platform. Those of you out there in Radio Land, just a moment, those of you out there in Radio Land who want to enter additional questions, there's still a chance. One question from the remote group that I'll mention comes from Alessandra Chirico. When pleading for a single authority for legal certainty and consistency in implementation, are you wishing to have a supranational body with powers in digital? Maybe a thought. Okay, let's see now. We have 2 questions here. Would you please introduce yourself? First you and then you. And we'll be bringing a microphone around, which is important because the people remote need to hear you as well.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. My name is Friedrich Lucke. I'm an economic analyst at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. I wanted to ask about a topic that you didn't really touch on so much, which is taxation of digital revenues. Do you think that as part of a digital strategy of the European Union, there should be a recommendation for member states to introduce digital taxes? And do you think that one of the reasons why Europe is lagging behind other continents in terms of AI startups and innovations is perhaps also due to financing constraints that could be potentially also alleviated by the revenues of a tax on digital revenues? Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman here, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm David Garcia Fellow from Hungary Strategy. My question is more addressed to Mr. Vos, but I think all speakers touched upon this issue of reforming GDPR. We see that there's a trend in this wave of digital regulation where the co-legislator has agreed on more restrictive and very often more prescriptive norms compared to the original proposal by the Commission. In the case of the Data Act, some MEPs are proposing to remove the possibility to reuse data on the basis of legitimate interest, which is one of the cases that are provided by GDPR itself. So how would you assess the risk if we open negotiations about GDPR2 that we end up having a more restrictive set of rules instead of something that would be more flexible as you're presenting?
Interesting question. Well, why don't we then give the speakers an opportunity to respond to each of those? Just to mix things up, why don't we do first Ms. Sipkes, and we'll do reverse order this time.
Okay, great. I'm I'm a simple market regulator, so I'll skip the text part. That's one. Maybe the first question on the digital authority, and I have no. So our job is to kind of advise co-legislators on what we think is wise to do, and then we just await the results. So I think also that is, as you said, more directed to Mr. Vos. On the issue of one large digital authority, I think that if you would, there's two risks I see. One is, as I said, and I think we have all said on the panel that regulating digital or making actually rules on how to play the digital game in Europe, rules on how to make sure that the European digital market develops in the way that we think is in line with European values. That digital is not one sector, and meaning and digital in line with European values is about open markets, markets that work for businesses and people, about safety, security, resilience, privacy, innovation, and competition. So, I mean, that is so much that will be creating one supervisory authority of everything, which has, well, a big chance of not being a very lenient or agile authority. And also, of course, the reality is, with every organization, that it takes a whole lot of time and energy to create a new one. So I think, and that would actually be a waste of time given the need for speed, so to say. So I think strengthening cooperative ties might help us both on content and on speed, and being the most efficient and effective way to achieve effect. That would be my take.
Do you see prospects for doing something analogous to what you've done at European level?
I think we are. If you look at the creation of the DMA high-level group, for example, and the fact that the digital service coordinators are also expected to have a European forum. So there are two mechanisms that will have to be thought of, worked through, but the Commission is already starting to call this DMA high-level group together, and to make sure that we proceed and we start that work. So I think that will work. And we, of course, have already two directorates, DG Comp and DG Connect, which are very active in enforcing both DSA and DMA. So okay. I think we're a long way, yeah.
Fair enough, thank you. So any that you care to jump in on then?
Yeah, on that one, I mean, my co-panelists are probably much better placed to talk about this, and we usually refrain from engaging directly in the enforcement discussion at a legislative level, so we focus on the issues that concern us more directly. I think at the end, and it's a more general observation, it's a bit of culture in how you make the alignment, and I think the example in the Netherlands is a really good example where it can work without necessarily creating this mega authority. The digital tax, I'm not sure I can really say much to it. It sounded more something like another example of fair share transfer, and this is probably an economic question which needs to be answered, and I don't think we have the time now to go into the fair share proposals that are circulating. And then the Data Act and the public interest in it, and the risk, I think, what we have seen in the e-commerce directive is that for a very long time the Commission has refrained from reopening the e-commerce directive based on the fear that the core principle of the e-commerce directive, which is the country of origin, could be weakened, and I think for a couple of years that was certainly a risk. But I also feel that by looking at it really thoroughly, the Commission came up with a really, really good way of dealing with it, because they kept the e-commerce directive intact and really just focused on the intermediary liability in the reform, which is now the DSA. So, I think there is eventually ways to think through this. Interestingly, and this is more high-level thought about GDPR and more generally on fundamental rights, but we have a system in the human rights framework and the fundamental rights charter that is very much focused on the singular rights, the data subject rights. But what we have seen in this data spaces is that we really need to think about collective rights sometimes as well. We've seen it in the COVID, we have seen it with demographic groups. So for that, I think the engagement with academics to thoroughly think through this and then bringing this in and being more creative in how you can frame these issues is something worthwhile to engage with as well.
Those are some really fascinating comments. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you get to make the closing intervention here.
So I try my best. Regarding the question of the authority or agency or whatever it is. So what we are doing right now is asking in every single legal tool for an administration oversight and so on. But everything has to be concentrated on a kind of a digital development. So I'm getting more and more a fan of this idea and saying we need a horizontal approach also in this controlling and having guidelines and so on, that we are not having guidelines only for data protection, only for competition, only for digital services and so on. I think we need a horizontal approach. That's why I'm getting more and more fan in combining everything. So otherwise, probably also you can balance better data protection with competition and so on. And this would help at the end for the whole development in digital issues. I'm not sure if they should have all the power, but they should give guidelines. Probably we have different structures than in place, but there is one regulatory body in saying this is how we would like to go forward, and interpretations and so on. This is what we have started to think about in the AI Act on the URI committee level, because at first, I haven't been a fan of an additional EU agency, but if you're seeing this in the long run, it would be more helpful in coming forward in this horizontal approach. Coming to the taxation situation, of course, I'm always a fan of that all companies who are doing the business here should also have a kind of a taxation, but I think this is somehow already regulated, or we will find a way to it, and then this might develop. But the problem here, of course, is once again politically. The competence for taxation is with the member states, and they do not want to see the European level in interfering the question of taxation and so on. But I think we are coming forward with it step by step, probably not as a kind of as a 100% solution already, but the idea is there. The GDPR thing, yes, it's always a risk if you're proposing to the European Parliament at the end something to open it up, and there might be a risk in having a kind of a worsened result than what you should have in mind. But here I think we need a kind of a very good prepared Commission, and being also flexible and also being very strict to a legislator. It seems a little bit weird, but if you have the idea in just focusing on one problem, you can do this, from my point of view, surgically try to help or to heal this problem in a way. But if then we are coming forward with other ideas and what we should also add here and there, then the Commission should say, so this is not part of the legislation right now. And so then I would say we can come forward, but we need this political courage of a Commission in correcting also a legislator in saying we would like to legislate only on, let's say, Article 33, and that's it. And I do not want to add something in Article 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever it is. And then we can come forward step by step by solving some problems. Yes, politically it's always a risk that we are opening up everything, but here we need a kind of a strict control also of a Commission being prepared also to withdraw the proposal if this is going into the wrong direction. This is what I have mentioned already with the AI Act, because I find these so fundamentally important. If we are doing this not right and supporting European AI industry in a way and making it more and more complicated, it won't help. We will die in beauty, and this is not helping anyone. So that's why I think we need to be more stricter also on the proposals and the outcome of what the legislators are doing, and being prepared and withdrawing if we are going too far. Sorry. If we are going too far.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you to all of the speakers. We generally try to open and close these sessions on time, so this is in fact a good time to close. I would invite the audience to thank our three wonderful speakers. This for me has been a very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much. Now, for those of you who are physically here, we have aperitivo in the next room. And for those of you who are virtually here, I guess you can just enjoy it vicariously from afar. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you once again to our wonderful speakers.
Thank you, Scott.